I want to talk to you in this session a bit of an introductory overview of liberation theology in Islam and perhaps a bit of an introduction to my own ideas. I'm essentially a theologian, I'm essentially a Quran scholar, and in the next 2 days I probably want to talk to you about the question of violence in Islam and more specifically in the Quran. And I'd also want to talk about socio-economic justice in the Quran. So the second two talks is much more specifically about the Quran and the challenges, I think, that is faced by modernist Muslims or moderate Muslims in dealing with the Quran. I'm not interested in dealing with their challenges. I'm interested in. I'm not interested in answering their challenges. I'm interested in critiquing the problems that liberal Islam and modernist Islam faces as it tries to shape its Islam in response to the demands of power. And so in the next 2 days, I'll be doing this in relation to the question of socioeconomic justice, particularly as reflected in the shorter Meccan surahs, and I'll be dealing with the question of jihad, violence, and non-violence. But for today, I want to speak a bit about liberation theology. It would be good if I had. Oh, I can watch my time on my computer. Shortly after the invasion of Iraq in 2003 by the United States and its allies, I was a professor at Harvard University at that time, carrying the rather embarrassing title of Professor, the Al-Walid bin Talal Professor in Contemporary Islam. I never used it, by the way. I just simply said that I was a professor in Contemporary Islam. So shortly after the invasion of Iraq, when I was there, Condoleezza Rice's office, she was then the Secretary of State of Defense, she called a personal assistant of mine and inquired about whether she could have a meeting with me. And this, my secretary, my personal assistant, being very aware of my opposition in general to imperialism and to the United States particularly, both its domestic policies and foreign policies, suggested that I may not be quite up to the idea of such a meeting. Her secretary was somewhat taken aback by this. And she said, why wouldn't he be keen to meet her? I mean, isn't he like a progressive Muslim? My PA laughed at the idea that when it comes to Muslims, the only requirement to be regarded as progressive is to be critical of traditional religious authority. Here, someone, Condoleezza Rice, who would herself loathe to be described as progressive with its usual leftist connotations, she was happy to embrace the term for a possible Muslim conversation partner. My acquaintance correctly understood that I was unwilling to meet with Rice. Given her public warmongering, I did not believe that she was really interested in a genuine dialogue, but simply in search of acquiescent intellectual partners in a game where conversation and dialogue were mere additional weapons for the soft weapons in a war to further US global hegemony. Now, there is a necessary and even ethically required tension in words that we use. We choose words and words choose us. And in so doing, we may consciously or subconsciously exclude and elevate others. This is particularly the case with words which at a casual perusal are often ideologically laden. Words such as progressive, liberation, and words which are ideologically laden but not obviously so, such as theology. And we see a heightened contestation around these words in times of war, and these words themselves often become casualties thereof. Until the event of September the 11th, 2001 in the United States, for example, I was quite content to be described as a progressive Muslim. After those attacks, the expression was speedily and consciously appropriated by many Muslims, desperate to differentiate themselves from the barbarian Muslims who inflicted this injury on others, and more significant, who wanted to present themselves as friends, safe friends of the West, without any critique of the hegemonic impulses and its selective, simultaneous support and denunciation of terrorism. And so I want to clarify the meaning of Islamic liberation theology by offering my understanding of each of the constituent words towards understanding an Islamic liberation of theology. I often do this, and in some ways it smirks of the joyful multiple discourses of postmodernity. I often use the word towards rather than defining. There is an element of jurism in there. There is an element of trial and error, of tentativeness. And tentativeness is generally something that I embrace. And so, yeah, tentativeness is something that I embrace. I kind of dread absolutes. I dread absolutes in fundamentalisms. And at the same time, I do not embrace tentativeness or jurism as an element, as part of a discourse to duck hard questions about justice and injustice, and the need to take sides, and the need to fight wars, and the need to oppose wars. And so, when I say towards an Islamic liberation theology, I don't mean that there is no clearly articulated theology or manifestations of this in the Muslim world. I, for one, have for decades been in the forefront of articulating a liberative perspective of Islam, both as a scholar and more particularly as an activist in the field of anti-racist and anti-sexist struggles, working for the dignity of people living with sexually transmitted diseases, environmental justice, and global imperialism. I have consistently tried to integrate this commitment with the theological and textual tradition of Islam, the Quran, and the Sunnah, Muhammad's prophetic precedent. At the same time, I have embraced an indomitable certainty about the presence of a transcendent force in the world. This transcendent that the Quran describes as Akbar, a transcendent that Muslims name as Allah, a transcendent that sometimes Muslims reduce to a, say, a cricket mascot. When, say, the Pakistanis go to war with the Indians in a cricket game, then they pray to Allah to give them victory over the Indians. Or they reduce him to just another born into Islam Muslim, in the way that the Malaysians, for example, or the Pakistanis increasingly don't want to use the word Khuda. The Pakistanis, for example, don't want to use the word Khuda anymore, a more kind of universal concept of God, and insist that people must use Allah. Or in the same way that that some Malaysians, for example, now want to introduce a law whereby only Muslims can use Allah. So, understanding all of this, I speak to the Akbar, the eternally transcendent. So, that's one of my certainties. The evil of racism, of sexism, of environmental degradation, and all forms of discrimination. I embrace the certainty along with a theological jurism, a tentativism, always alert to the possibility of error and constantly aware of revolutionary arrogance that allows yesterday's revolutionaries to become today's fascists. At a movement level, I have been a part of a South African organization, the Call of Islam, that embodied Islamic liberation theology in relation to the struggle against apartheid, and in Positive Muslims, which try to do so in relation to the stigmatization and marginalization suffered by Muslims living with HIV. My employment of towards is a conscientious pause, my alertness to the fact that we too, regardless of our certainties, may fall prey to a semantic arrogance and a claim that words can only possibly mean what we intend them to mean. Second, intrinsic to liberation theology is the notion of ideas being continually reshaped by liberative praxis. For us, a number of impulses are certain and universal. The impulse to identify with the marginalized, the impulse to revolt against injustice, and to be suspicious of dominant paradigms. Answers are never simple, only the transcendent, are never absolute, only the transcendent is. Answers are the outcome of reflection on praxis, action in solidarity with the marginalized. And because these reflections are based on ongoing praxis, the resultant theory or discourse is inevitably and invariably tentative. Truth for the engaged interpreter can never be absolute. As one's hermeneutic continuously moved on, one is pushed towards an ever greater increasing and authentic truth. Truth in turn leads to greater liberative praxis. The Quran is explicit that there is a truth, al-haq, to be known. And it is possible to have deep convictions, yaqeen, about it. That only dimensions or layers of this truth are knowable, however, is acknowledged in both traditional and in contemporary scholarship. The difference in liberation theology is that it does not aim to prove eternal truths that are applied subsequently to history. It does not merely reflect on existential truth that is poetically disclosed through history. Rather, liberation theology, in the words of Rebecca Chopp, helps to create truth. For theological reasoning is uttered upon a truth that is away, upon a word who has pitched tent in the midst of history.